Great. Well, we can probably go ahead and get started. We're a few minutes after, and the participants have slowed down a bit. So thanks everyone for coming. Welcome. This is the fourth event now in the educational series on voting reform. In the first year, we explored some different methods for voting, and in this one, which is being co-hosted by the Florida Forward Party, the Utah Forward Party, and the Colorado Forward Party, we're hosting a guest expert speaker on proportional representation, which is not quite a voting method, but rather a result of elections. And so joining us, we have Dustin Wahl, who's the Partnerships and Communications Coordinator, I think, at Fix Our House, a relatively new advocacy group on the scene. So I'll go ahead and let Dustin take it away.
Thank you, Curtis. I'm super glad to be speaking to you all today. Like you said, I'm with Fix Our House. It's an organization that's just about a year old. We launched formally this last spring. You might be familiar with a couple of our co-founders. Lee Drutman is a political scientist at New America. He co-founded this organization along with Charlotte Hill and Ellie Zupnick. And then we have a board of advisors that spans the political range. We're a nonpartisan organization that is just focused solely on proportional representation and sort of sowing the seeds for this change when the opportunity for reform opens. So I've got a presentation that I'll go through. I wondered if this might be like super unscientific or impossible to do, but I wondered if by a show of thumbs, you can give a thumbs up in your Zoom chat area. I wondered if I could ask how many people on this call feel like they have a decent understanding of what proportional representation is already, and how many don't give a thumbs up if you don't know what it is, or only know a little bit. Okay, seeing some thumbs. Well, I don't want to. We won't get too into the weeds at first. If you want to, that's great, and we can do that more later on. But we'll get just into the weeds enough to give you a grounding in what we're trying to do, what we're advocating for. But I first just want to say too that we're very inspired by what Forward is doing here. I mean, it's cool that you all are taking the time to discuss these things, start these conversations about reforms. Whether it's different forms of voting or entirely different electoral systems like we're talking about here, or protecting voting rights or trying to make voting elections more secure. This is all, crucial work in our democracy today. And it's genuinely so encouraging and inspiring to see people and organizations, meeting these challenges by starting these discussions. So super proud to be involved with what y'all are doing here. Let me share my screen to start my presentation for you all. I'm able to do that. All right, are you seeing that? Looking good? Okay, cool.
Yes, we are.
Great. And I will start this slideshow. So we're Fix Our House. As I said, we launched about a year ago. It's a nonpartisan organization. We have a board of advisors ranging from the far left, people that would want to start a party outside of the Democratic Party because they don't think the Democratic Party is to the left enough, ranging to conservatives who would want to start a different party because they're dissatisfied with the Republican Party, ranging to libertarians and sort of every shade in the middle. We have voting rights advocates on our board, good government groups, business organizations that have representation here. So like spanning the political spectrum. So it's important to us to focus solely on a better system that we think is fairer for everyone and doesn't specifically benefit one party or the other. So why we're doing this? Essentially, we think politics is broken. This would not be a controversial statement, I don't think, in this group. But we think that politics is not only broken, we think that there is an identifiable repeating cycle happening in our political system. Our co-founder Lee Drutman calls it a doom loop. Where polarization leads to more dysfunction, leading to more polarization, leading to more dysfunction, leading to more polarization, and the cycle just continues. So sort of how this works is, the stakes of our politics feel very high and emotional. You see this every time there's an election. You see headlines that say, this is the most important election in history. And then you wait 2 years and you see another headline saying, no, this is the most important election in history. And the cycle just continues, and that, it leads parties to see each other as existential threats. It leads to what Lee Drutman calls doom loop logic. Just focusing solely on keeping the other party out of power. This is where you see the lesser of two evils come into play. Maybe you don't love one party, but you hate the other party so much that you just have to fight them at all costs to keep them out of power. And it leads us to live in bubbles and cut ourselves off from each other, both in terms of how we get information and otherwise. Okay, I think it feels like we're in the clear now. So
maybe. Sorry about that, everyone.
Maybe, hopefully. No, that is the perils of the Zoom era. That's how it goes. So we left off talking about dysfunctional systems, like it seems like there's parallels there. But anyway, basically, we think that the problems that America is facing are somewhat unique to our political system, that this doom loop is something that happens uniquely in our two-party system, that, the lesser of two evils kind of logic, like we were talking about, you don't hear anyone ever talk about the lesser of three evils or the lesser of five evils. And that if you are able to break up our binary us versus them two-party system into a multi-party democracy that's more reflective of what voters actually believe, that would be a healthier democracy that would be free of a lot of the serious problems that are threatening our system. And that this cycle is just repeating over and over again. We see it probably even more every single election year. And there are these events that are happening that escalate the conflict in our country. And everything becomes kind of an us against them war. So we think that the cycle isn't just going to stop on its own, that it's a problem with our system that can be fixed and addressed by a systemic solution. But alongside this, rising division, you see some really dangerous effects. You see that stat there that says 33% of Democrats and 36% of Republicans say they would feel somewhat justified in using varying levels of violence to achieve their political goals. Now, that's just one statistic, but there's a lot of other research that's similar to this, making similar claims about when the stakes of our politics feel as high as they do, and sometimes are as high as they are. It can really lead to a feeling of justification of more radical action, including, extremism that becomes violent. And this is a really dangerous situation. I'm sure we all are thinking of specific examples. January 6th comes to mind, when the intensity of our politics broke out into violence. And there's certainly other examples as well. Political leaders on both the left and the right and everywhere in the middle being targeted, and having, violent threats, facing violent threats. So the cost of all of this is very human and very real, and very dangerous. And so we think, that raises the stakes for us. And our current system is wildly unrepresentative. Maybe this seems like a bit of a different point, divergent from what we've just been talking about, but I think you'll see it's pretty closely interrelated. Look at those examples on the right of Arkansas and Massachusetts. Arkansas is generally known as a red state. Massachusetts generally known as a blue state. But about a third of each state voted for the minority party's candidate in the 2020 election. You see 35% of Arkansas voted for Biden, about 32% of Massachusetts voted for Trump. That's a huge chunk of those states that doesn't support the the dominant party in that state. And the problem is that in Arkansas, Democrats, maybe make up about a third of the state, but they don't make up a plurality of any one district. They have 4 districts. They're all safe for Republicans because Democrats are spread out over the other districts. In Massachusetts, Republicans are spread out throughout the state. They don't make up a majority of any one district, and so they're completely locked out of representation in Congress. Proportionally, Republicans in a state like Massachusetts, where they have about a third of the state, proportionally, they should get about a third of the state's 9 districts. But when you use single member districts where you just have one representative in each district, that's not possible. So, the effect of this is that, the vast majority of districts around the country are completely uncompetitive, completely safe for one party or the other, and it prevents millions of Americans from having any voice at all in Congress simply because of where they live. And so you see, it's not just in states like Massachusetts or Arkansas, where 100% of the state is controlled by one party or the other. It's also something that we see nationwide. Around 90% of districts, rather around 90% of Americans live in districts where the outcome of the election is basically decided before the general election in the party primaries. So, the upshot of this is that most districts throughout the country aren't competitive for the 2 major parties. Once a candidate makes it through their party primary, which pulls them to either the left or the right, then they're good to go. And they can kind of skate by in the general election in a lot of cases. And then money just pours into these races that are competitive, and they become war zones and kind of proxy wars for the 2-party larger conflict. But if you stop and think about what this slide says, 90% of Americans live in districts where the outcomes are likely determined before the general election. That's insane. We have a democratic system where, at least tacitly, we're supposed to the people are supposed to be represented in Congress and supposed to feel like their vote has an effect on what happens in the legislature. And the fact is that for most Americans, when they go into the voting booth and cast a vote for Congress, they often feel like it doesn't make much of a difference because they know what the outcome is going to be because of the way that their district is drawn. And so gerrymandering entrenches these problems. I'm guessing on this call, there's probably a great deal of familiarity with what gerrymandering is, but a really quick definition is that basically it's just parties drawing districts in a way that benefits their party. You want to pack your opponent's voters together into a small number of districts so that they make up a super majority of a small number of districts, and then you want to crack and spread out the remaining voters from the opposing party so that they, their share of the vote is diluted across many remaining districts. And so you see some examples of this on the right, districts that are weirdly shaped because of, the way that they were drawn to benefit one side or the other. Although I will say gerrymandering is not always, it doesn't always look as dramatic as the examples you see. But regardless, gerrymandering is a terrible problem. It's politicians choosing their voters instead of the other way around, which is how it should be. But it's not the only problem here, and it's not the core problem. It just is exacerbated by the system that we use, single member districts, which make it possible in the first place. With our current districts, politicians are allowed to draw the maps the way that they want, paving the way for potential minority rule in some states, in some areas, and further reducing the number of people who live in competitive districts around the country. Even independent commissions, which are the most important tool that we have in the toolkit right now to draw fair districts, they can't even solve the issue entirely, because even if you have independent commissions that draw your districts in the fairest way possible, that are explicitly not supposed to benefit one side or the other, they can't magically make districts like all competitive Frankly, it would be bad if they could. It's kind of a paradox that we want competitive elections, but if all elections are competitive in this system, well, then you could have a wave election where 100% of your representatives are chosen by just 51% of the population. So you really you start to see a paradox with single member districts and a lot of things like gerrymandering that are only possible in this broken system. And so go figure, people have lost faith in the current system. You see that line there shows the percentage of Americans who have a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in Congress. Not surprisingly, it's extraordinarily low. Obviously, there's a lot of reasons for this, but having a Congress that is dysfunctional, that is as dysfunctional as ours is, where it's hard for legislation to be passed, it's hard for compromise to be found. These are products of the system that we use to elect these leaders, and certainly affected by the two-party doom loop. And without significant reform, all of this, in our opinion, is just simply going to get worse. You see more headlines like these examples every day, where people are expressing a lack of faith in democracy. People are worried about, will we have a democratically elected government, in the future? Fear of civil war and other kinds of violent conflict, like we've been talking about. The U.S. has been downgraded, by organizations that monitor democratic health. And we think that reform is urgently needed, that it's not something that our system can do without. So now to talk about the slightly happier stuff, what we can do about it, how proportional representation could offer a solution to these problems. You see that example that we were talking about earlier with Massachusetts and Arkansas. That's our current system, where, as an example, there's that picture of John, an IT professional in Little Rock, who leans Democrat, but has no voice at all in Congress and little hope to change that reality because of where he lives. Or Mary, who, is a small business owner in Springfield, Massachusetts. She's a Republican, but has no voice in Congress because she lives in a blue district. But then look at down below the proportional examples, where you have a mix of representatives representing each state. Arkansas, instead of having just 4 districts, would have only 1 district for the whole state. Now, these are just examples. We drew these up this way, but this is roughly what it could look like. You have a larger district that elects multiple representatives in proportion to their amount of support. So if you're trying to, if you started this call uncertain of what proportional representation is, that's kind of the key takeaway sentence for you, that it's a system where we're electing multiple representatives instead of just 1 per district. You're electing multiple representatives per district, elected in proportion to their party's amount of support. So if your party has 60% of the vote, you should get roughly 60% of the seats. If your party wins, roughly 1/4 of the vote, your party should get roughly 1/4 of the seats. And so you'd lose the situation in Arkansas where one party the Republican Party in Arkansas is able to win 100% of the seats with only a fraction of support, and the same in Massachusetts. And you would be able to break up the two-party binary. You see there, the example has 2 red dots in Arkansas, 1 blue dot, and a yellow person. Maybe that's an independent, maybe that's somebody from Forward, or a different party that pops up in the area. Same in Massachusetts. You might have different kinds of candidates representing different strains of their party getting elected. There's, I think, a couple different shades of red there. I mean, do you think that Mary in Massachusetts is exactly the same type of Republican that you might find in Kansas or the Dakotas or somewhere in the South? Well, probably not. There's regional differences and cultural differences and economic differences that affect, the type of political ideology that people have. And so it would make a big difference, and we'd have a much more diverse system if we were able to break up this, binary two-party duopoly, and you do it by means of proportional representation. So we'll get into this a little bit more, but this is kind of a basic summary of how it works. Let's see. There you go. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here because this can get really technical. But I'll just basically cover it as a summary. This is how proportional representation basically ends our two-party duopoly. So there's this law of political science called Duverger's law, which says that essentially single-member districts with plurality voting, like we have in the United States, where you just have to win more votes than your opponent to win the seat, that leads almost inevitably to a two-party system like the one that we have. And that's thanks to the spoiler effect. We're familiar with how this works. You see it a lot in a presidential election where, third-party candidates will run and the two major party candidates will say, no, don't vote for that person because you're just throwing your vote away. You're just making it harder for the side closest to you to win. And that's a bad system where, real differences within the electorate can't be reflected in the parties. But it's true that having, more options in a two-party system can sometimes hurt the choice that's closest to what you believe. And you see how the number of representatives per district affects this law's ability to work. So when you have 3 representatives in your district, the threshold to win a seat is lower. When you have just 1 representative in your district, you of course can't divide that person, right? They have to represent whoever wins the plurality of support. But when you have, a 3-member district or a 5-member district, the threshold to win a seat is much lower. So imagine, you don't have to imagine this because you all are involved in the work that the Forward Party is doing. But imagine if you're starting a small business and there's a rule that you have to capture 50% of the market in order to compete as a small business. That would be crazy. And it wouldn't work, and that's why it's so hard for third parties to be able to compete in the current system, because the only goal in the system is to win more votes than the other team so that you can win a seat. But when the threshold's lower and there's multiple seats to go around, well, then it's a lot easier to win a seat, especially if you pick certain areas in the country that might be beneficial to focus on as you're starting a new party. The threshold for a 5-member district would be like 16.6%, roughly. That's doable, right? That's a much lower threshold to get over. So that's kind of how this works. Let's see. So then there's multiple possible voting systems that work with proportional representation. And these are just a couple examples. We'll briefly touch on them, but there's other ways to do this as well. One of the most commonly talked about in America is combining proportional representation with ranked choice voting. There's a few countries that do this. I know Ireland does this. Australia's Senate is elected this way. I know you've had a presentation before from ranked choice voting supporters, and probably have some familiarity with how it works, but it's really simple. You just rank candidates according to how much you do or don't support them. You can combine it with the option of giving a voter the option to either rank the candidates, or if they don't want to rank the candidates, if they feel confident in just choosing their party, then they could just choose the party that they support that has a slate of candidates that they've nominated. And then according to that, candidates will be chosen in proportion to their amount of support. With ranked choice voting, when one candidate hits the threshold needed to win a seat, then the votes they have in excess of that number will then go to the second and the third place vote getters on their ballot, and it trickles out into a system where you have all the benefits of ranked choice voting combined with the effect of having parties be represented proportionally in the legislature. Now, some countries just use a party-less system. This is pretty normal. It's foreign to how we vote right now in America, but worldwide, it's pretty normal to just go into the voting booth and check a box for one party or the other. So that's also an option. Then there's also a system called mixed member proportional, where you keep single member districts. So everyone still has one representative representing them in their district, but you combine it with a party vote. So you go ahead and have the vote for the single member representative. And then if, say, we have some examples here, say the America First Party is way underrepresented because of the way that their votes are spread out geographically, or maybe they're gerrymandered out of power or something. But they win, say, 15% of the party vote, meaning that 15% of voters want America First representative. Then there would be, in excess of the district representatives, a number of at-large representatives that would be assigned proportionally to even out the net total of representatives, so that roughly you'd meet proportionality for each political party in Congress. So we could talk more about this. I hope that was somewhat clear. It can get kind of confusing, but at the risk of boring those of you who don't want to spend a ton of time talking about voting thresholds, we'll move on and we can come back to those. Let's get to the good stuff, the reason why we're doing this. There's a lot of benefits to this system, and it fixes a lot of the core problems of our current system. So I'll touch on these, then we'll go over them in a little more detail. This really fixes a lot of the binary us versus them nature of our politics today. It doesn't completely fix all of those problems, but it fixes the lesser of two evils problem. It fixes the demonize the other party, the other candidate at all costs problem. It makes it easier to run on something and for something rather than just running against the other side. It gives everybody a voice in Congress, no matter where you live. Your district's lines don't limit you from being able to have an impact on who represents you. It makes gerrymandering almost impossible. It makes compromise, motivates politicians to reach compromise and to find solutions to legislative challenges. And it makes voters want to participate in the process more because it's more functional, and because they don't, it doesn't feel hopeless to cast a ballot when you know essentially what's going to happen with the outcome. And so studies show that voter engagement increases in proportional systems where people feel and recognize that their vote matters. So yeah, no more us versus them. Right now, parties are able to succeed ginning up outrage about the other side. Not to say that that sometimes that outrage isn't well placed. I'm not trying to minimize anything here, but but both major parties benefit from this, right? Like it or not, that it's really helpful to be able to run against the other side. You see that little chart below that shows the number of voters saying that they were primarily voting against Biden's opponent. 68% saying they primarily saw their vote as being against Donald Trump when they cast ballots for Joe Biden. 30% of Trump voters saying the same thing. We're not talking about the presidential system yet, and we can in the Q&A talk a little bit about how we think presidential politics would be affected by this change. But that phenomenon of primarily voting against a candidate at the congressional level, at least, would go away in the system. So it gives everybody a voice in Congress. It ensures that all voters have real representation, including the Democrats in Arkansas, the Republicans in Massachusetts, and Republicans living in Denver, you know, in the inner city, and Democrats living on the you know, the plains to the east of the Rockies. It also fixes gerrymandering. It's almost impossible to gerrymander a multi-member district, to carve them up into safe and swing districts. You know, particularly when you have independent commissions drawing multi-member districts, you have that sort of extra shield of support. But you know, Americans understand that gerrymandering is a major problem. Both parties recognize it. It's something that can't be fixed when we keep single member districts. So we think this is, if you want to stop gerrymandering, this is the reform for you. And it makes compromise necessary. It makes compromise attractive for our leaders. You know, I think if you were to talk to a lot of representatives in Washington, you know, whether you support them or not privately, I think there is a lot of desire, or at least some desire still among elected officials, to go back to what some of them see as kind of an old way of governing, where you can reach compromise with the other side, and you can come together, and you can work out deals that, you know, don't completely satisfy one side or the other, but that are just good deals that give a net, you know, end up in a net good for the people. Because outright majorities in a proportional system are rare, no single party is seduced by the lure of permanent majority or lives in fear of permanent minority status. Instead, in a multi-party democracy, there's coalition building with shifting alliances and bargaining, which is what the founders of this country, you know, wanted. And voter participation would increase, like I mentioned. The US right now is 30th in voter turnout. That's pretty embarrassing. We can do better. And having a system where people recognize that their vote counts would solve it. Under proportional representation, different ideological factions would recognize that they're empowered to run candidates under their own party banners, sparking higher turnout general elections in which voters feel engaged by the parties that actually represent what they really believe. So we think that not only do we have all these benefits that would come from a proportional system, but we also think that it's practical and comparatively realistic to a lot of other major reforms. You know, the big hurdle to get across when you're talking about reforming our system is obviously, you know, does the Constitution allow this change, or would we have to go back to the Constitution and amend it to make it possible? Well, with proportional representation, you don't have to do that. You can just skip that hurdle. Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution gives Congress the ability to change how Congress is elected. That's Congress's responsibility. And they have the ability to make this change. So it's relatively simple compared to most other major reforms like this. Congress could simply pass a law. It's also consistent with our traditions. You know, this is something that I think sometimes gets looked over in this conversation, but you know, for those of you that know your history, there was little that the founders feared more than a system where we were divided into just two parties, you know, fighting over the direction of the country. You have that John Adams quote, "There's nothing I dread so much as the division of the Republic into two great parties." George Washington's farewell address, you know, he spends a lot of time focusing on the fear of factions, of breaking up into us versus them politics. We've done it in America before and during the Civil War. And it feels like in a lot of ways we're there again in our complete us versus them binary political system. This would be a change that would allow the scrambling of that two-party system in a way that's much more reflective of what the framers had in mind. And you're seeing states see the potential for these kinds of reforms. You know, ranked choice voting, again, this is a separate reform. Fix Our House is not advocating for one specific form of voting that would go along with proportional representation. But we think it's really helpful when states are adopting reforms that make more sense than the current system that we use. And you're seeing systems like ranked choice voting do really well. I know we were talking before this call, Fort Collins just passed a law to use ranked choice voting for the city, which is super exciting. And Maine and Alaska are using it, and it's winning elsewhere around the country as well. Top two systems in California and Washington. These are a little bit different primary systems, but again, they're signs that the appetite for reform, for systemic electoral reform in this country is growing. And so that's really exciting to us to see this happening in other spaces. Portland, Oregon just became the largest city in the country to adopt proportional representation for its city council. There's a few other cities that use it as well, but we're really excited about that win in Portland and what that portends to the rest of the country. And there's current proposals in Congress to do this. There's Don Byer's Fair Representation Act, which is a bill that's been introduced several times now, I think for the first time in 2017, if I'm not wrong, that calls for ranked choice voting with proportional representation. And I believe has independent commissions drawing the new multi-member districts. So it's a fairly prescriptive bill that, you know, you could just vote for that one bill and kind of have everything you need ready to go. We're also focused at Fix Our House on this 1967 Uniform Congressional Districts Act, which repealing that would allow states to begin experimenting with this reform on their own. So basically, what it is a law that demands that at the national level, districts are drawn to just be single member districts. The reason for that, I won't get way in the weeds with it, but if you draw multi-member districts with multiple representatives in each, but without a standard for proportionality, then it's possible then it's likely to have one party walk away with the whole state, right? So if you have the state of I think Mississippi might have been one of the states that was doing this before the law was passed. It was basically a way to lock out Black representatives from power entirely in the kind of the civil rights era. And so this law was passed. It was a good law meant to prevent states from being able to do that, from being able to rig multi-member districts. But it needs to go further. And so we're looking at a repeal of this 1967 law with a call for proportionality. So allowing states to begin drawing multi-member districts with the stipulation that they have to be proportional. And there's growing momentum behind this. We talked about this a little bit, but we are excited to see momentum in local areas around the country, and also just desire nationally for major reform. Lee Drutman testified before the Committee on Modernization in Congress this last summer and talked a little bit about proportional representation. We're hopeful that in this next year, there are more advocates in Washington that get behind this and around the country as well. So I'll just end by briefly touching on our theory of how this change could happen. We think that obviously this is a big task, a big change, but we don't see this system just fixing itself. And so we think that things are getting worse in our politics, that the doom loop is continuing, and that we might reach a point where our political system is breaking such that people are kind of pushed to the table and need to have reforms ready to go to fix the problem. And so we want proportional representation to be the kind of go-to reform when we reach that point. It's not really a cheery note to end on, I suppose, but we are, like I said, we feel good about the growing excitement around not only proportional representation, but around electoral reform overall. And it's encouraging to us to see organizations like Forward popping up, recognizing that there is a need to break out of this two-party duopoly. And so that's that's part of what makes us excited about this going forward. So we'll stop there. I know we can get to Q&A stuff. I also just wanted to mention, I'll maybe mention this again, but if you want to learn more about this, you can go to fixourhouse.org. You can sign up for our newsletter there to stay engaged with this conversation, or you can follow us on social media at Fix Our House on Twitter and on Facebook. So, but we'll go to Q&A, Curtis, if we want to kick it off.
Awesome. Yeah. Nate Allen, a state lead from Utah, will be helping us run Q&A. We're going to go ahead and do a little test and see if all the bad actors got bored here and left us. So I'm going to switch chat back to fully open functionality and then be ready in case there's some immaturity displayed, and we'll lock it back down if needed.
Cool. No worries.
And Nate, there's already a bit of backlog in the chat with some questions to work through, and then everyone else feel free to throw a hand up and we'll start a line that way as well.
All right, we'll go ahead and get started with the ones that are already in the chat. So the first question on here I'm seeing from Lindsay: under a PR system, how would district boundaries be determined? What is the criteria?
Yeah, that's a good question. So districts would still be drawn, assumedly by state legislatures, which currently draw districts. But so say we adopt Don Byers' bill, which calls for independent commissions to draw these lines. Then you'd have a system, of course, where it wouldn't be in the state legislature's hands, it would be in the hands of an independent commission. And so, but the drawing of the lines is actually significantly easier in a multi-member district system than it is with single-member districts, because a lot of the things that you have to be concerned about with a single-member district are easier when it's just a larger group. I mean, in a state like Arkansas or Oklahoma, where you have less than 5 or 6 representatives in your state, you probably just have the whole state be one district. It would essentially be at large at that point. Obviously, that takes that removes the need to draw lines at all. For larger states, yes, you would still have to have either a commissioner or the legislature draw those lines, but it's a significantly easier process. It's very hard to manipulate. It's technically possible to do some amount of gerrymandering, but the wins that you would get from gerrymandering would be very minor and low compared to what they are now, and it would be much more difficult. So I hope that mostly answers that question. It would be the line drawing, like, legal process would theoretically be similar to how it is today, unless independent commissions take over, but the actual doing it would be a lot easier, a lot more straightforward.
All right, our next question is from Celeste. How many of the countries with better turnout than the US have some form of compulsory voting? I think this is in reference to where we ranked 30th.
Yeah, that is a good question. I don't know off the top of my head, though I don't think, I don't want to just take a guess. That's a very good point. Compulsory voting isn't the norm in a lot of these democracies. So I don't think that's the main thing that's coming into play there. But that's a good point.
All right, next question from Dave. What about if Congress isn't able to form a governing coalition? Since we don't have a parliament, would that give the president even more power?
That is a good point. Yeah, there are some people that talk about, the idea that America should have its leader chosen by a legislature, like a parliamentary system. That, of course, you would have to change the Constitution to allow that. But I'll just say that, look at what we're comparing Congress, what we're comparing this theoretical proportional system to. Congress right now, can't. It's a dysfunctional body that can't sometimes build a coalition strong enough to pass basic legislation. And so the difference, I know it gets concerning and weird to talk about coalition building, because then you have the fear of not being able to build a functional coalition. First of all, one thing that would probably be important to clarify is that the number of parties that a country has is closely associated, as we kind of touched on, with the number of representatives in its average size district. So, people will look at Israel or Italy or a country like that and say, holy cow, a proportional representation system is very scary because all these tiny parties are able to pop up and form that might be radical, or, then it's that much harder to form a coalition. A country like Israel, it basically has one district for the whole country. It's an at-large system. And so that's how they're able to have so many, minuscule parties. In a system where you have, a couple of more conservative leaning parties, a couple of more liberal leaning parties, forming a coalition is significantly easier than it would be in a larger system where you have just all kinds of parties. So coalition building is tough. Like, this doesn't make politics suddenly easy, but that's the system that the framers wanted. It's a system that does work very well for the majority of democracies around the world that are proportional systems. So yes, there's coalition building and forming that would have to take place, but that I think is a problem that we want to face compared to the level of dysfunction that we do currently have.
All right, we'll go to our raised hand. Eric, take it away.
Sorry, just had to unmute. Yeah, I just have a few concerns about proportional representation. I guess they generally fall into kind of the one, just generally with electoral reform, and then some of the assumptions made. But the first off is when we're in an environment where we at Forward Party are trying to do so many electoral reforms. I worry we're trying to stuff too many things in the bag all at once. And, we as Forward Party say we're about the data, but if we're trying to do too much at once, I don't think we can glean very reliable data about what's working and how. And so, I think proportional representation may be a good idea to consider, but I think it's at this point maybe something that should be put on the back burner while we reform our single member districts that we currently have, and then get the data back and see how it's going. Anyhow, my other point is that some of the assumptions that you make, things wrong with the country. Of course, gerrymandering is bad, and there are some districts where it is really egregious. But actually, if you look at in aggregate the last election, gerrymandering really isn't that bad. And I'm not saying that there aren't specific districts, but I mean, Republicans got less than 2% more seats than the Democrats, and but they got like 3% more votes overall. The Republicans actually got the majority of the votes, which they haven't done in presidential elections, but they did in the congressional. So when you look at it that way in aggregate, in this last election, the gerrymandering issue was really irrelevant. So Yes, it needs to be examined. And here in Virginia, we had an independent or almost independent redistricting commission, and it actually worked pretty well. Both of the major parties were unhappy, and so it was a good. The districts were generally thought to be pretty fair. And then, I guess my last point, I'm going to have several, but the last one you kind of touched on just a few minutes ago. You were talking about some people worry about extreme parties, and I think that you're wrong that it would eliminate us versus them. I think it would increase it. You look at Germany, you look at Italy, you look at Sweden, all their recent elections, I think they have ample evidence that it would increase it. AFD in Germany is 32% of the Bundestag. That's ridiculous. A quasi-Nazi-ish party. Brothers of Italy has 30% of the Chamber of Deputies. And then you add in the Northern League, they have 16.5%. That's 46% of the seats. Sweden, the Sweden Democrats, which is their far right party, has got 21% of the legislature there. And then France, I know France, they use 2-round majority one district, but National Rally currently has 15% of the seats. And in 1986, France actually temporarily went to proportional representation, and that was the first breakthrough for the National Front, as it was then called. And they had 35 seats. And then the following election, they realized they screwed up, and they went back to the one member district, and the National Front only got 1 seat. But since then, it's been clawing its way back. If they currently were at a proportional system, they would have more than the current 89 seats that they have. So I think the evidence is that us versus them would increase, and that it would be dangerous, especially in the Trumpist environment we're in. We have a history of civil war. We have a history of racism. The kinds of parties that would begin to pop up is very scary to me.
Understood. Yeah, let me jump in and try to address a few of those things. You raised a lot of good points. Let me start with the last thing you were talking about with you compared the European countries that have 30% support of the AFD in Germany, Brothers of Italy having a big chunk of the legislature, Sweden's Democrats with about a fifth of their legislature, but all of those are not coming close to majorities. And the fear in our two-party system is that one of our two major parties, was essentially taken over by Donald Trump in 2016, and how could that be impacted by, or how could that impact our system in the future if you're able to essentially pole vault into power because you're one of the two major parties. Now you mentioned the popular vote, Republicans winning the popular vote in this last cycle, which is true. Some of that, though, is because there were so many uncompetitive gerrymandered districts that Democrats didn't even run candidates in a number of these races. So they're not getting any votes. So that affects that popular vote number a little bit. But to your point that gerrymandering, isn't like the main enemy here. We totally agree with that. Maybe I didn't emphasize it enough in the presentation, but gerrymandering is terrible. It's an awful force in our politics, but it's not the root cause. It's just something that is enabled by single member districts. Like we kind of talked about, it's pretty much impossible to gerrymander, multi-member districts, and so it's fixed by this solution. But we're with you that it's not the ultimate end all be all concern. Let's see, what else did we touch on here? Well, I'll leave it at that and come back to you can remind me if you want me to address something else that you said there.
All right, we have a couple more questions from the chat and then we'll go back to raised hands. So the next question is, I would like to know how this works with star or approval voting.
Good question. Yeah. Have you had presentations from approval voting folks and star folks before? So I'm not familiar with any system around the world that uses proportional combined with star or approval. You don't see that as a primary proposal here very often. So, but again, we don't take a position on what the best voting system would be to use a proportional representation. And part of that is because we think by repealing the 67 law that keeps states from being able to do this on their own, you would be able to see states become laboratories of democracy that would kind of experiment and be able to choose the system that's right for them. So if star or approval voting advocates want to try to make a proportional version of that system, awesome. Go for it. And we think that states should be able to do that and begin experimenting that way.
And Neil, you probably know, oh, sorry, real quick. Neil, you probably know for sure there is an already accepted version of both approval and star that results in PR, correct? Awesome. We're getting the thumbs up from you.
All right, our next question from Dennis. How would it work in Arkansas if there were 10 parties / candidates? This is going to be, okay, I'm going to try to read this well. If there were 10 parties / candidates and they all got about the same amount, in parentheses 8 to 10% of the vote, is it just the top 4 vote getters who go to Congress? And how does RCV work in that scenario, since there is no need for looking at a second choice?
I'm not sure maybe I'm not understanding.
It's a lengthy question.
Part of the question. I think I know roughly what it's getting at, which is it's a good question. Like, what if the state is, has 10 parties that are all sort of equally competitive? That's really unlikely given the political science of, the number of seats in your district will generally roughly determine the number of political parties that are able to compete. So I'm not trying to dodge the question by saying it's unlikely, but I don't think that would be a primary fear here. But even so, I mean, that would just be a very, very competitive election with a number of parties vying for support, and it wouldn't be that dissimilar to a very competitive election where right now, if one party wins 50% or 51% and the other party wins 49%, well, 100% of the seat goes to the party that won 51%. And that's not, that's a pretty dramatic inflation of that party's support and power. But that's the current system that we use. So, regardless, like it would much more closely match, much more closely represent what the people in Arkansas actually think, even if there were parties that that were similarly sized in terms of their amount of support, but ended up being locked out of power. And with ranked choice voting, I mean, I'm not sure I understood the last part of that question, but if you're using a ranked choice system, then you would have second and third and fourth and fifth favorite candidates or parties kind of trickling down and winning power that way.
Well, I guess really the basis of my question was the slide where you showed like the percentages, like if there were 3 districts, then 25 or 3 positions, 25% plus 1. But I was trying to think of how that works if something's like really lopsided. So maybe a different or better lopsided example would be the Republican got 70%, and then the remainder was split amongst some other parties. And then you have somebody like the Libertarians saying, well, hang on, we got 4%, so we're entitled to one of those 4 seats. I mean, it's a really extreme example, but what's kind of the minimum that you really need to lay claim to a seat?
Well, so I think I understand better now. Yeah, and so the minimum is determined by however many seats there are in the district. So I probably should have spent a little more time on that slide. It wasn't super clear, but in a district where you have 3 representatives per district, then the threshold mathematically is 25% plus 1. So then your example of a Libertarian winning 4%, like that's not enough to get over that threshold. So, they wouldn't win a seat in that scenario. But if the Republican Party in that scenario wins 70%, then that would certainly be enough to win 2 seats, because, you'd get across the 25% plus 1 threshold for 1 seat, and then you get across it for the other. And you probably end up having, Republicans win proportionally about a third. Now that's less than 70%. So it's an inexact science, right? The only perfect way to do representation would be to have like for every single person, in America representing themselves. And obviously that would be a dysfunctional, chaotic system. So, there's rough proportionality here. Like it's not exactly perfect, but in a situation where Republicans win 70% of the vote, then they get roughly that number of seats. But then the threshold gets lower for a system like if you have 5 members in a district, then the threshold is mathematically about 16.6% plus 1.
Right. Yeah. So I guess I'm thinking about scenarios where the math kind of breaks down. Like, so if I understand then what your explanation, let's say the Republicans get 55%. So that's going to be 2 seats.
Are we talking in a 3-member?
Yeah, in a 3-member. But then say hypothetically the Democrats and the Libertarians split, like 23-22 out of the remaining. Is it just then whoever got the second most votes gets that remaining seat?
Yeah, it's as long as you hit the threshold. You have to hit the threshold.
But neither one of those hit the threshold. The Republicans got 55, so that leaves 45. But 23-22, nobody hits that threshold.
Sorry, yeah, I'm thinking in a what's called a single transferable vote, which is where you combine the ranked choice and a proportional system. So I am thinking in terms of ranked choice voting here. But then, yeah, you would have in that system, those votes, because you're using ranked choice voting, would be reallocated to their second and third and fourth picks. So you eventually have someone winning over the threshold of support in that kind of system. A partyless system, that's a really good question. I'm now kind of racking my brain thinking how exactly that works with the threshold, but it plays out such that yes, if Libertarians eke out a win over the Democrats, the Libertarians have more votes at the end of the day than the Democrats do, and they're sort of second most, and they're second in line behind the threshold for support or for winning a seat, then they would win the seat.
Okay, thanks.
Definitely.
Our next question is Neil.
Hi, thanks. Great presentation, and I'm just thrilled that you all are doing this stuff. I mean, I guess I just wanted to respond, if that's okay, to a little bit more about the questions about different voting methods. So there are ways to achieve proportional representation with different voting ballot formats. So in ranked choice voting, you rank the ballots. In approval voting, you have voting ballots just like you do today, and just approve of. You can vote for multiple candidates, so you can approve of as many as you like. In star voting, you you rate each candidate, which I think is a little easier than ranking them. But all of those systems have methods of achieving proportional representation. And actually, ranked choice voting has tabulation methods used in Utah that do not achieve proportional representation. So we have to be really specific about how to tabulate the ballots. Sweden actually used a form of proportional representation, a tabulation method of approval voting proportional representation a while ago. So those are all absolutely possible. And the main point is just to make sure that whatever method you use does achieve proportional representation. And I just think that's so much more important than, I don't think it's possible to reform single member districts, as someone suggested. It just runs into all the problems that the presentation gave. So, and we're certainly seeing gerrymandering making a big problem in many state legislatures and in city councils. So again, thanks again for a fabulous presentation.
Sure. Yeah, appreciate that. And I mean, and you know, I think I stated this earlier, but I mean, Fix Our Houses is really only focused on the proportional side of it. So whatever the system is, ranked choice voting, a party list system, another form of voting like star approval, if the result is to create a system where a state gets a proportional outcome so that, you know, your party's amount of support is equal to your amount of representation in the legislature, that's what we're trying to do. And these discussions about, you know, which voting system might be better for one reason or another, they're super important to have too. But we want to get to the point where states can have that debate and have it be a really practical debate that actually affects, you know, what might happen in the state. And we do that by getting rid of that 1967 law. I mean, I've joked that it's like it feels like such a boring kind of inane legislative tweak, but it's like the effect that it would have would be like the exhaust portal on the Death Star. You know, it's just like the little thing that you fix, and then the implications are gigantic.
All right, next question is from Lindsay. I believe that the House is currently limited to 435 members, and some states have only one representative. How would you see this changing under a proportional representation system?
I am so glad that you asked that. That is a super important topic to touch on with this group. So Fix Your House is not focused on increasing the size of the House. You could do this, you could move to proportional representation in the current system that you have, where the number of representatives that each state has would remain the same. Now, a state like Wyoming, or I believe there's 5 states, the Dakotas, Wyoming, Alaska, and I think Vermont, correct me if I'm wrong, someone, but I think those are the states that just have one representative right now. Those would still just have one representative. And so if we don't increase the size of the House, then you would have a system where you would still have 5 single member districts, at least. Now, you know, Lee, our co-founder, has testified before Congress on the importance of increasing the size of the House. We think that politically speaking, it might make a lot of sense alongside this reform. Politicians don't normally, you know, cast a vote that might, you know, hurt themselves. And there would certainly be politicians losing their jobs if we were to adopt proportional representation without increasing the size of the House. And we have a very small House compared to most democracies, compared to what the founders wanted. I believe if the original Second Amendment of the Constitution had been ratified, it wasn't, so it didn't become an amendment. But I believe if it had, we would have something like 7,000 representatives in the House today, because it set a specific formula for doing that. In about 100 years ago, we just stopped increasing the number and couldn't agree. The two parties couldn't agree on a formula, so we just stopped at 435. And so, you know, raising the increasing the size of the House could make a lot of sense, and could work really well with this reform to make it so that, you know, smaller states with only a couple of representatives or with only one would be able to have the differences in, you know, political diversity in their state also be represented proportionally. But it's a good point that right now, the system as it is, there would be a few states like South Dakota, where I grew up, that would still only have one representative.
All right, next question from Ed. Is there a version of the ballot that fixed our House thinks would work best for the US?
Version of the ballot, meaning voting system, I think, probably.
A PR system, I think.
Yeah, no. Short answer, no. We again, like, states could experiment to adopt their own voting system that has a proportional outcome, and we think that's kind of the ideal situation for, you know, Colorado to adopt you know, one version, and, you know, another state to adopt a different version. There's there's a lot of ways to do it, and no, we don't pick one that's our favorite. Now, I mean, the Fair Representation Act, which we think is a good bill, that is currently, has been introduced in Congress, does include ranked choice voting specifically, and we think that would be great. We think it's probably a more likely avenue to not have that prescriptive reform saying, okay, all states will now use this ranked choice voting system, and allow them to begin doing it themselves, whether it's with ranked choice or something else. So yeah, short answer, no, but there's a lot of ways to do it that are good.
Ed, is your raised hand to clarify this question? Looks like he might have froze. All right, we will go on.
I think he was saying yes as he froze.
I know, right?
It's actually for a different question. Hey, you guys hear me okay?
Oh, now we can, yeah.
Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah. No, it's actually for a different question. So feel free to go to the next person. I'll wait my turn.
Okay. All right, I think our next question is from Celeste. Celeste, you can go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
So my question is about the Fair Representation Act. So I guess I'm a little surprised that, and I am happy that you're flexible on what method to use for proportional representation. But I guess I had figured, since Lee Drutman wrote the book and was super in favor of the Fair Representation Act, that was a big push for fixourhouse.org. So my question was, what's the strategy to get the Fair Representation Act passed? I've been watching the number of co-sponsors. I got my rep to sponsor it, and it hasn't budged very much. So.
Who is your representative?
Joe Neguse.
Oh yeah, great.
So I'll tell you what I did before he was even running. Well, when he was running, before he was a representative, I asked a question at a candidate forum saying, do you support this? And I explained it a little bit. And then every time I saw him after he was elected, and Joe Neguse said, I need to find out about that. And then every time I saw him, I asked him if he was supporting it or if he found out about it. And then when I told him it was HR 4000 in the previous congressional session, he was so impressed. Like the numbering of those bills is a big deal. And somebody with some power assigned HR 4000 number to the Fair Representation Act in the previous congressional session. And so at that time was when he ended up supporting it. Now it's 3863, I think, and it'll change in the next session, but yeah.
I love that you stuck to Neguse on that and kept bringing it up to him. Yeah, I mean, Your question's a really good one, and I think there's probably a lot of people that are familiar with that bill that would say this is a great bill. Like, why aren't we moving this as a legislative vehicle? I think not to get too deep into the politics of it, but I think that bill right now probably doesn't have it. I think that that Buyer and the other co-sponsors probably see that not taking off, not having the support that it would need if they were to have kind of the internal party fight. The Democrats support it and trying to get Republican support for it as well. I don't think they see that as the fight to have at the moment, that it would have a net positive effect or that would be successful. But I don't speak for them. I don't know. That's just, again, I don't want to get too deep into the politics, but that would be my guess. I think that we see it as a very good conversation starter, as a good, kind of legislative vehicle to present this idea. And that, introducing a more, more modest repeal of the 67 law, which would allow states to do it themselves, is probably easier to achieve, probably easier to win Republican support, because there's a great states' rights angle here. Let states be laboratories of democracy that I think a lot of conservative representatives can really, really get behind.
So I don't know if everybody here knows, but the very first woman elected to Congress, Jeanette Rankin, was elected in a multi-member district back when they still had them. It was Montana. They elected 2 congressional reps, and she came in second in the 2-winner race, and she got elected.
I love that. Thank you for bringing that up. We didn't really touch on the effect of a proportional system, or even just having multi-winner districts, the effect that has on not just partisan proportionality, but also other forms of proportionality. How many women are serving in Congress in proportion to their numbers, how many, of other groups around the country. So it's a better system that way too.
All right, looks like our last question as of right now, can proportional representation be applied to the allocation of the Electoral College? And I'm going to stop there because I'm not sure what the last part is meaning.
Well, no, because the president is just one job. If I'm understanding the question correctly, I don't think that would work, because you can't divide one person. It's the same reason that proportionality doesn't work.
I think they mean the Electoral College votes themselves, which presumably for many states there are. Actually, I guess for all states there's more than one.
Meaning, sorry, say that again. Maybe
so maybe half of the state's Electoral College votes would go to one nominee, while the other half of the
sure,
Electoral College being winner takes all.
Yeah, not right. Understood. Yes. Yeah, we would see that as kind of a separate reform, probably a good, like, I know Nebraska does that. It's more accurate to what the people in your state are saying and how they're voting. But that would be a separate thing than proportional representation, but also a smart sounding reform to me.
All right, go ahead, Mark.
Okay, guys, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I was, just as kind of a comment off of some previous talk about maybe having too many options out there as to what we want to look at and focus on as if the floors are ready. I feel like it would be helpful, and I'm wondering if Fix Our House is putting much attention towards bringing proportional representation towards more city and state legislatures, and not entirely just a focus on the federal legislature. but I feel like that can certainly add a lot more opportunity for those laboratories of democracy to, bring in some data and actually see like how does PR compare if we do it in this particular state or a few more of these cities at the same time as other people trying out, various forms of single winner methods. I'm just wondering if Fix Our House is focusing so much on at least bringing PR to the state level or more city levels.
Yeah, that's a super good question. And I agree with you that that's a really key, I shouldn't say a really key fight. It's 1,000 really key fights, in each of those areas to begin doing this. So yes, that's something that we think is really important. We're primarily focused on the national level, primarily, largely because that's where our strengths lie. And we do think it's possible to do at the national level. And, while cities adopting this is really key, local governments adopting this is really helpful. It would also be really helpful if states could be able to adopt proportional representation, and that only works if we repeal the 67 law or otherwise tweak the law. So, but I'm with you that's that anything that can be done locally is really key. And even when it's not, proportional representation, we're thrilled by the local voting reforms that are happening around the country.
Yeah, and my understanding is that the 67 law is only stopping states from sending their federal representatives
That's right.
proportionally, but it's not doing anything to stop states from, if they want, choosing to just send their own state house reps proportionally or their state senators proportionally.
And there are a number of states that do currently use multi-member districts, just without proportional representation. We don't have any that have the proportional model. And again, sorry, for their state legislature, like you said.
Yeah.
And that conversation is taking place in a number of states, I know. And so, yes, I'm with you that I think that's a really important part of this national reform, having the states begin to do it themselves. And I remember you brought up at the beginning of that point, you brought up what I know Eric was talking about earlier, which I forgot to respond to, which was just, I totally get the problem of having like so many solutions and so many like, okay, well, which do we want to pick? We need to focus on something. I think that's a very real concern, and I would just say that we think a solution with as much reward and as little as you would have to do to make the reform possible. That's why we think, like, that's why we started, Fix Our House, like, because we think it's important enough that this should be the main reform that gets plugged in to the whole when there's an opportunity to do this. So yes, it's a real problem, and I totally get the saturation and kind of the reform circles. But we'll have that argument that we think this is really not to say that the other reforms are less important or anything like that, but that this is a really special one in terms of the effects that it could have on our system and the way that it could fix some of these serious problems. I'm still talking, and I'm realizing that I'm probably over time, but I'm happy to keep going if you want to, or your
I
call.
think that was a great closing line, and we'll call that the end of the questions since there's none sitting. I'm sure we could keep thinking of more, but thank you so much, Dustin, for joining us. Can we get a big round of applause via reaction or camera if you got one? That was seriously great and fantastic Q&A. You're super knowledgeable, and we really appreciate you sharing that expertise with us. Thanks everyone for coming. Couple quick plugs. Now that we've kind of done this next step past just voting methods, we're going to probably look at doing some discussion types events where we now sit down and discuss as a group these various methods and reforms, and which might be priorities or which might be more important, as well as try to convert this information into digestible educational resources to share externally, so we can start widening the conversations around these reforms. So if you're RSVP'd with this event, you'll get an email invite to those follow-up events, but already be thinking on what you might bring to the table for those discussions as we work together. And then if you're a Colorado resident, quick plug for our petition, because we just launched it for our minor party status. If you're not already on the list to help there and you'd like to, this is how we get party status and party status and ballot access. There it is. So go ahead and send an email to our general email, which I'll put in the chat, and we'll get you connected to Dennis. Any finishing thoughts, Nate?
Nothing on my end. Thanks, Dennis. Dustin, that was a great presentation. Appreciate it.
Definitely. Yeah. Thanks again for hosting.